Hi everybody, this is the week 14 lecture. We're getting pretty close to wrapping things up this semester, and these last couple of weeks, obviously we know where the nation is headed, and the last couple of chapters deal with those last few months leading up to the beginning of the Civil War. So we finished off last week. Lincoln has been elected in November of 1860. And this brings all those questions that have been asked kind of to a head. There have been growing sectional tensions, threats of disunion, threats of war, a lot of rhetoric on both sides, but it's always been worked out through compromise, as we've seen over the last several weeks. But this is kind of the last monumental event, Lincoln's election. This Republicans coming to power supposedly will bring everything that Southerners have feared to truth. So Lincoln's elected, and now the Southern states have a choice. What are they going to do? Are they going to accept his election and go on with the Union, or take action that they've threatened to take for years? Part of the problem with this is the South is not a small place, right? Is made up of many states, many people with different economic ties, family ties, cultural ties, all these things. So are they going to be able to act as a whole? And that's one of the big issues when Lincoln's elected. What will the South act together or separately? A last-ditch effort after Lincoln is elected is the Crittenden Compromise, introduced in December of 1860, and this is another attempt to try to avert disunion, or worse, to avert war. And the Crittenden Compromise basically is 6 amendments to the Constitution. Number 1, it would reinstate the Missouri Compromise line of 3630. Everything north of that line would be free, everything south slave. Congress would not be allowed to ban slavery in any federal held areas. So military bases, for instance, in the South, Congress would not be able to prohibit slavery there. Slavery would not be prohibited in the District of Columbia, and they could not interfere, Congress that is, with the interstate slave trade, which we know is very important. It's how slavery has continued as the cotton states seek that slave labor. They have to get it from other slave states. Slave owners would be compensated for fugitive slaves that were lost, and most importantly, maybe, is the fact that the Crittenden Compromise prohibited any future amendment that would undo any of these amendments. So this is the last attempt of politicians to try to fix this problem. Of course, it's rejected. There are many reasons why it's rejected. Probably the most glaring and obvious is it is asking the Republican Party that has just won the presidency, the party that's come to power, it's essentially asking them to throw out their platform. They were elected largely on the grounds that they would not permit the expansion of the institution of slavery. Not only does the Crittenden Compromise allow the expansion of slavery, but it essentially guarantees that there will be no future attempts or efforts to dissolve the institution. So it's not successful, and that last-ditch compromise goes down. So within just a few weeks of Lincoln's election, several southern states, are calling conventions to discuss secession. And 2 days after the Crittenden Compromise is introduced, South Carolina actually secedes from the Union. And South Carolina, we know, has had a difficult relationship with the Union over the years. If you go all the way back prior to what we've talked about in this class, the South Carolina has talked about secession before, has refused to recognize laws passed by the federal government, notably the Tariff of Abominations during Andrew Jackson's presidency. So South Carolina takes a chance. South Carolina isn't sure how the rest of the nation will react, but they're kind of riding high on the election of Lincoln and the emotions that stirs up in the South, and they take a chance. They secede and keep their fingers crossed that the rest of the South will secede with them. Doesn't happen immediately, but pretty soon after, within 8 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks of South Carolina seceding from the Union, you have Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and then Texas are going to also secede from the Union. So we have those first 7 states gone, and notice where they're at. It's very important, right? They are cotton states. They are states that make their living on the production of cotton with the help of slave labor. And what's their big fear in Lincoln's election, the Republicans' election, is that slavery will be attacked, ended, limited, whatever the case may be. They believe that there is a sincere threat to their way of life and their livelihood. By February 18th of 1861, the South has a government. They have a constitution, a president in Jefferson Davis, and this new country has been born. I have given you the Confederate Constitution in some of your supplemental reading in this module to go through and take a look at that and see how similar it is and what key differences there are in that document and the United States Constitution. You'll notice that with a few minor administrative functions, that slavery is really the key difference in those two documents. So it worked to an extent for South Carolina to take that risk in December and secede from the Union, because they got 6 states to go with them, and that's a pretty big deal. And how did they do it? Probably it had a lot to do with just the emotion of Southerners when Lincoln is elected, and everybody is so upset, and there's this frenzy of activity, and people are afraid of what election of a Republican president means to their way of life. So South Carolina and proponents of secession took advantage of that opportunity and kind of struck while the iron was hot, so to speak. The problem is the upper South, right? States like Virginia, most importantly, they don't secede at this time. And this is a big deal to the Confederacy. Why? Because Virginia is really kind of the foundation of the South. It's one of the biggest, most populated, wealthiest, well-connected states in the South, and they have not seceded. So that means that the Confederacy doesn't have access to the power and resources and people that Virginia holds. So that is a scary proposition as the Confederacy moves forward. And you'll get in the reading from Potter that other states in the Upper South, Virginia included, held secession conventions, and they were in some cases soundly defeated. And why is that? It's not so simple that, the Lincoln's elected, so slave states secede, and the Union tries to force them back in, and it's a war. That's not at all that simple. It's a much more complex issue, especially in the Upper South, where these states are tied to the North economically, culturally. Families live across state lines from one another, so it is not that easy for a state like Virginia just to leave the Union. The loss of slavery, while that might be damaging to their wealth and culture, so is the economic loss that Virginia would no doubt suffer by leaving the Union. Now, the catch is that, if you recall, slave states, the southern states, essentially as a whole, have determined not to allow the Union, the federal government, to force any other southern states to bend to their will. So here we are, while Virginia is hesitant to secede, they appear to be strongly Unionist. They are also strongly Southern, and they believe in states' rights. They believe in the right of states to establish their own government, their own laws, and to not be interfered with by the federal government. So it's a catch-22. They want to remain in the Union, but they've kind of promised to act unilaterally with other southern states should those states be attacked or coerced or forced into doing something that they don't want to do by the federal government. So the South is still largely divided, even though we have a new Confederate nation. The problem for the North is nobody's really paying much attention. And in a more modern, not completely modern, example, I would refer to World War II and the rise of Hitler to power in the 1930s. Much of Europe and the United States, they had their own troubles. They were not concerned. They didn't pay attention to what Hitler was doing, and he was able to create a military and rise to power really unchecked. And this is kind of similar now. We're not really paying attention to what's going on in the South. We have, for decades, had this argument over secession. The South has threatened to secede. Some states in the South have threatened to secede if certain things happen, and basically if slavery is threatened or taken away. But they never have. It's always been talk, right? And many Northerners, and Southerners for that matter, they really feel like, well, this is the same old story. The South is upset because Lincoln's elected. They're going to threaten secession. They're going to threaten war, and nothing will ever come of it. We'll have a compromise, and we'll come back together as a nation. Everybody will live happily ever after. That's not happening now. And part of that is there's really no network to spread that information, right? The Republican Party is a northern party, so you don't have a southern wing of the Republicans able to express this dire future. We don't have a national news media or news outlet, so we don't really have Fox News. I hate to use that as an example, Fox News or CNN, to spread the alarm, right? To say, look, this is what's happening. Think about it. Today we're global. You can get on you're taking this course completely online. You can get online and find out, you can read almost any newspaper in any state that you choose. This was not the case in 1860 or 61. If you lived here where I live in Indiana or New York or Maine, you weren't familiar with current events in places as far as the deep South, places like Alabama or Mississippi or Texas. You didn't know what was going on. You weren't reading those letters to the editor or the editorial articles, the editorials that newspapers are publishing. On top of that, you have the current president, the lame duck president, if you want to call him that, James Buchanan. He, to say the least, does not handle the situation well. And he was between a rock and a hard place. There's not maybe a lot that he could even do, but to be sure, he did not do much. He's blamed the Republicans, the incoming president, and his party for stirring up this slave trouble, right? At the same time, as he blames the Republicans, he is telling the South, or sending a message to the South, that what they are doing is illegal. They cannot secede, and it's his job to enforce it. So this only further pushes southern states away from the Union. They feel further isolated and further attacked. So at Lincoln, he'll be inaugurated within a few weeks of the new Southern creation of the new Southern government, and there's no plan, really. They don't know what to do about secession. There are ideas, don't get me wrong, but remember, Lincoln is in Illinois. He is not in Washington. He won't come to Washington until it's almost time for his inauguration. He's not necessarily working with the current government to make a plan. The new Confederate government is conversing with Buchanan and his administration, but not Lincoln or his future administration. So they're not prepared. But what secession does do, if you recall, the Republican Party is coming in on a platform of stopping the spread of slavery, which is very controversial, North and South. When the South secedes, now Lincoln and his administration are coming in to save the Union, right? And that actually is what is going to unite the North, so to speak. All of a sudden, it's not a divided North or a divided nation, North and South, with a divided North, pro-slavery or anti-slavery. It's now a united North, pro-Union. And that's very important, this change in the rhetoric, right? The change in the mission of the incoming president, so to speak. Americans, as Lincoln is coming into office, have essentially three options. They have to work something out, allow the South to go peacefully, let them create their own nation and go their separate ways, or there's going to be a war. That's what it's coming down to, and of course we know how that's going to end. As we move forward into the next chapter, what's happened is there are some federal forts in South Carolina, in Charleston, Fort Moultrie and Fort Sumter. The United States Army garrison is at Fort Moultrie. That's determined to be largely indefensible, that in the event that the South Carolina does attack or the Confederacy does attack, U.S. troops there do not believe that they can hold that fort. So in an attempt to set up a defense on December 26th of 1860, the garrison at Fort Moultrie moves to the fort in Charleston Harbor, Fort Sumter. And this, of course, outrages the South, outrages South Carolina, because it looks like that the hope for compromise is over, that this is, I don't want to call it an act of war, but it's certainly an aggressive move, right? Because if everybody was going to get along and we were going to work out our problems, there would be no need for the garrison to move from Fort Moultrie to Fort Sumter. But this looks like the United States is preparing for some sort of assault or worse yet, war. After that, after the move to Fort Sumter, it's really downhill from there towards war. South Carolina demands that federal troops leave. Buchanan can't do that, of course, that he cannot give up, politically, I should say, he can't give up a federal fort under threat basically of being attacked. South Carolina says you need to move your troops out or else. And of course the president, he can't do that. He tries unsuccessfully to reinforce Fort Sumter. As you may or may not know later on, we'll find that the soldiers garrisoned there, they only have limited supplies, right? So Buchanan's going to try to reinforce them, send in reinforcements and supplies. He does that with the ship, the Star of the West, but batteries in South Carolina fire on that ship. No one's hurt. The ship turns around, does not reinforce the fort, but basically the shots have been fired at the Star of the West. We don't consider that the start of the war. When the Star of the West was attacked, like I said, nobody was hurt, and Union troops did not respond. So the ship retreated, and nothing's going to happen until after Lincoln's inauguration, when we move to the actual start of the war. But that's where we're at. Like I said in the module this week, I have some extra reading for you. I know you love to hear that, but I want you to take a look at Alexander Stephens' cornerstone speech, where he outlines basically what, and he's the vice president of the new Confederacy, he outlines what is the cornerstone of the Confederacy. And not surprisingly, that cornerstone is slavery. And also I've put in the Confederate Constitution for you to take a look at. Again, take a look at the differences in the two documents. Another discussion due this week. Have a couple of those left in one paper, so not a lot to get things kind of wrapped up here. If you have any questions, as always, let me know, and have a great week.